This podcast is all about improving your reptile husbandry. However, I know not everybody has the time or the money to go out and spend thousands of dollars doing custom builds. Thankfully, friend of the podcast, Josh Halter, aka the Bio Dude, is working hard to make better care more accessible. He makes turnkey bioactive kits for leopard geckos, ball pythons, tortoises, invertebrates, dart frogs, and the list continues to grow. He has spent years testing and perfecting these handcrafted substrates and dietary supplements to create the most effective products. If you visit thebiodude.com, you will see he is a proud supporter of both USARK and responsible reptile keeping, and there is an option to donate to either at checkout. Welcome back to the Animals at Home podcast. My name is Dylan Perrin, and thank you so much for tuning in today. Today I'm speaking with Luke Basulto, who is a longtime reptile keeper, a conservationist, and a tortoise biologist out of Southern California. In the episode, we discussed the intricacies of the desert ecosystem, including what species of reptile and plants are found there, and some of the challenges that come with trying to conserve those spaces. And we spend a large portion of the episode discussing the desert tortoise and why it's important to conserve and why it's critically endangered, and the role that that animal plays on the landscape of the desert ecosystem, which is just completely fascinating. And the story that Luke tells at the end is, I think, the closest I've ever been to tearing up on the podcast. So it is a remarkable story, and I'm so happy he shared it with us. So that is at the very end of the episode, so I do hope you, or I encourage you to get right to the end to hear that story. Let's jump into this episode. Enjoy. So before we officially get into today's episode, I wanted to share some news that I found out earlier this week, some sad news, and some of you won't know this individual, but I know many of you will know this individual. I learned that longtime listener of the show, longtime reptile keeper, and one of the patrons of my community passed away in February. That's Dirk. I know many of you have spoken with Dirk or communicated with him in the YouTube comments, or especially on the Discord server, or if you ever joined us on a keeper chat, which are our monthly chats. Dirk was there on every single one since we've been doing them. I do them with Liam Sinclair and Ellie Hills from Reptiles and Research, and Dirk was always there, and he was always somebody who gave me incredible advice and was super insightful about reptile keeping and a deep thinker. He would send me emails that were like paragraphs and paragraphs long of these just amazing things. I literally have a list somewhere that's just titled Dirk Ideas, because he constantly gave me really good ideas and was a very big supporter of the podcast. And he was also somebody that just cared. He really cared about people, and Liam and I were looking through some old stuff, some old emails after learning this news that he had passed away, and just emails of him just actually caring about our well-being and making sure that we're looking after ourselves and not just trying to focus on producing content and not worrying about our own mental health. And he was really amazing for that, and anybody who's interacted with Dirk knows that as well. Like I said, Dirk is somebody who literally came to every single keeper chat we had. We've been doing these for, I think, about 2 years now, and suddenly he stopped showing up a couple of months ago. And, the first one was whatever. The second one I was a little bit starting to wonder. By the time he missed the third one, I thought, I just don't have a good feeling about this. And fortunately, I had contact with one of his family members, and I reached out, and unfortunately, he had passed away. So anyway, I wanted this message to be at the top of the show to let you know that unfortunately, the herpetoculture community lost an incredible member this year. That's Dirk. Many of you will know who I'm speaking of, and many of you will already have had conversations with him through email or Discord, like I already said, and I know you'll be just as sad as I am to hear about his passing. He was somebody who was so passionate about reptile keeping, it was insane, and even like one of the coolest things about Dirk is he was actually a lizard keeper back in like the 80s and the 90s, and then finding Animals at Home podcast, Liam's channel, Reptiles and Research, Lori Torini's channel, he started to open up to the idea of keeping snakes, but he was actually petrified and terrified of keeping snakes. But eventually he got into keeping hognose snakes and was able to face his fear and care for them incredibly. He's one of the most thorough reptile people I've ever met. He has like enclosures and enclosures and enclosures for future iterations of snakes. As the snakes get older, he already had things set up. He had hospital tanks set up. Honestly, I'm sort of at a loss for words because of how incredible of a person he was. What I'm trying to say is, Dirk, you will be deeply, deeply missed by me and many other people in this community. I'm so sad that we didn't get to say goodbye and that it just was one of those sudden things. And I absolutely want to dedicate this episode to you. And really, I'm going to dedicate the future episodes to you as well, because you listened to every single episode. And I know you're probably still listening in some capacity to each episode. So this one is for you, Dirk, and moving forward, I'm going to be thinking of you as I continue to produce the show. You're somebody that really kept me going when it was hard and I didn't want to really do the show anymore. You're somebody that constantly gave me motivation and reminded me of the work that I'm doing is valuable. And anyway, rest in peace, Dirk. You will be deeply missed. And this episode and any episode moving forward is dedicated to you. Well, Luke, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for doing this.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. This is a cool one.
Yeah, I'm excited for this. A big shout out to Juan, a mutual friend of ours who connected us, and I think you guys must know each other from a similar area. So he said you got to have Luke on. So I'm happy about that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks, Juan.
Can you give us just a little background? Maybe just let us know where we're recording from today, and you know, some of your history with animals and reptiles in general.
Sure thing. Yeah, man. I'm currently in Joshua Tree, California. For those who don't know where that is, it's kind of maybe 45 minutes east of Palm Springs, kind of up in the most southern part of like the high desert. Yeah, I guess as far as my history with animals, it's one of those things. I think the story kind of repeats itself a lot in some of these interviews where he's like started at a young age, found a snake or something. But like, no, I think that my parents had reptiles before I was even born. I think I was born with a like Burmese python as a pet. Like my parents had like an albino Burm or something. And yeah, that's the rest is history.
Classic like 90s pet snake.
Yeah. I know. I think they got rid of it. They were like, oh, we can't have this big snake in the house with like a baby. And we were talking about having kids, and like I can't imagine having like a retic or something right now. Like that'd be a mess.
Yeah, you're definitely on edge for sure. And you obviously do keep some reptiles now. What do you keep?
Yeah, right now, have been doing it my entire life, I don't really keep like a ton of things. Before we had our daughter, I had a bunch of stuff. I had like a lot of king snakes. I was really into Cal Kings, kind of the locality stuff just from here in California. I had some local stuff, gopher snakes. I really love the Great Basin gopher snakes. After we had our daughter, I downsized a lot because we needed the room for like a nursery. So it was kind of like the trade off, I guess. But now I have a pair of some locality Iranian fat tails, the Angramanu, if that's how you pronounce it. They're from Chogazanbil, I think, if that's how you pronounce it. So I have that pair, and then I have a molking. of all the king snakes that like I ever thought I would end up like keeping like solo. I did not think it'd be a molking, but I found one at the super show, and I was like, this thing is awesome. And I started looking into them, and yeah, and I have those. And we also have the 2 desert tortoises. I mean, I have to have desert tortoises. Kind of been like one of those lifelong pets that we've just had. So
Yeah. Do you grew up in that area, right? Or around in Southern California?
Yeah, man. I grew up in Barstow, California, right between Los Angeles and Las Vegas. I tell people that, and they're always like, "Oh man, I'm sorry." And I'm always like, "Hey, like, relax, man. Like Barstow is cool." Like, yeah, I grew up in the desert. All I know is the desert. So yeah.
Do you have early experiences with desert tortoises that you remember that has made you kind of hang on to them your whole life?
Totally, man. Yeah, that's been the animal that like has had the biggest influence, I think, over my career trajectory, my like interests. Like, I think I have a picture of the first time I actually met a desert tortoise. My mom thankfully had like the wherewithal to be like, oh, this is like important. Like, I know he loves reptiles. This is kind of his first time meeting this really cool reptile, and like, it's just a picture of like my dad and me and my sister kind of crouched on the side of the road, and my dad's putting on gloves, which you're supposed to do, and like we're getting ready to move this tortoise off the side of the road, and I'm just kind of like sitting there looking at the camera, looking at the tortoise. And I remember that day. I remember like seeing that animal and being like, this is so cool, and like watching my dad like pick it up, and I was like, I want to pick one up one day. Like that's like my goal. That was like my biggest goal as like an 8-year-old or something, was to like pick one up. And my dad like explained to me like, oh, you're not supposed to, don't touch those. Like he didn't know much about them. But then he was working for Fort Irwin military the combat center out north of Barstow, and he was doing live fire like training drills, like setting up targets and stuff. And even then, the tortoise was protected to a degree, and they knew to be hands off with them. So that's about all he knew about the tortoise at that point, was you're not supposed to touch them. But yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. For me, being up in Canada, it's hard to, I mean, we see turtles and whatnot, but it is hard to imagine having a fairly large tortoise on the natural landscape in your home area. It just seems like almost like mythical in a way.
Yeah, man, they're such an important animal. I mean, here, I make the case a lot that we don't have our deserts or the areas where these tortoises live without them. The desert tortoise, especially the Mojave Desert tortoise, is a keystone species. Like its burrow, its ability to like move seeds around, like contribute to refugia for like the smaller animals, as well as like biodiversity and spreading around like annuals and perennial seeds. So if that animal disappears, like this ecosystem collapses. They're our equivalent of like the gray wolves to Yellowstone.
Yeah. Is there any rules about keeping them? Like, do you have to have permits or anything?
Yeah, so in the state now, they've just recently been uplisted to an endangered species on the state level. They've been threatened for years now, and about a week ago now, they were uplisted to endangered. And that doesn't change much about how you're able to keep them, at least not yet, or that I know of. But up until that point, you do have to have a permit to keep one in the state. The permit is really easy to get. It's not like as long as you show that you can care for the animal and you're competent in its care, and you have like the space for it, and you have everything set up, then they'll issue you'll see California Department of Fish and Wildlife will issue you your permit through a organization called California Turtle and Tortoise Club. They're really like the permitting body through CDFW or for CDFW. So yeah.
And I assume you just keep them outside. I mean, that's the nice thing about keeping a native species.
You kind of have to. I mean, like, this isn't an animal that like you can keep in a tank. Like they're big. They're one of the biggest reptiles in the country, and that's part of the reason why I think. Well, what is part of the reason why they're not allowed out of this state? Because anywhere you start moving, the further you move away from this desert, the harder their care kind of becomes. You're allowed to keep them within the state of California, which means that there's people in like Northern California who have desert tortoises, and those desert tortoises tend to do fine. But like it's such a specifically adapted animal that like, unless it has a desert, like something is not right about its care. There's always a degree of like compensation that has to be done versus like me, who there's tortoises on the other side of the fence of mine occasionally. So like, they're existing in an environment. It makes their care a lot easier in that sense.
Yeah. We'll talk more about the conservation efforts around that species, because I think that's fascinating as well. But just to put the size perspective for people, I did see them. I wish we had this conversation a few months ago, because I was in Palm Springs in October, just on a vacation, and I wish that would have been great to connect. But anyway, I saw the tortoises at the Palm Desert Zoo. They have a real like nice enclosure there for them, and so I want to say, are they like 2 feet kind of across, from like head to tail type thing? I kind of forget how big they are.
Yeah, they're kind of smaller in terms of like the other gopher tortoise species in the country. I'd say not about middle of the road there. They're a big desert tortoise. Like you measure them like across the middle of their shell. It's called like a medial carapace length. A medial carapace length of like 15 to 17 inches is a massive desert tortoise. So like right down the middle, if it's 17 inches or so, that's a big dude. And like we measure it in like millimeters. So like north of like 350 millimeters would be a big one. Yeah. Average size, they're probably like, I've seen a lot of tortoises, and I think like on average I'll keep it inches, but they're probably like 12 to 14 inches on average. Yeah, big animal, or big reptile at least.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about you have this sort of passion, obsession with animals early on. You connected with the desert tortoise as a young child, and then maybe just lead us through some of the career or education choices that you made along the way, and it will eventually work to what you're doing now, but you also have some pretty interesting past roles as well.
Yeah, man. So yeah, like I said, I grew up in Barstow, and like that's a community that doesn't get a lot of attention. I mean, it's there's like growing up there, there's not people coming in and saying like you could be a biologist or like you could do this. It's more like, there's generational jobs that happen in Barstow where you like work at like a military base, or you work at the railroad, or you work like for your family's local business that's been there for however long. And it's a small town, like honorable thing. But it kind of stifles like this ability, or this idea of going outside and like, exploring what else is out there. And it wasn't until I was about 17 where I had the opportunity to start working in this conservation field, more professionally. Up until that point, I had always like did my best to like read all the books I could, and like find the few places in Barstow that like had resources for me. So like we have this desert discovery center. We had the desert discovery center growing up, and it was kind of like our natural history museum. And I would just like lurk there, like every day after school. I'd walk there because they had a tortoise there, and they had turtles there and fish there. And I would just kind of hang out and like learn as much as I could, and eventually started volunteering there. um, and just wanting to know more. That was just like really hungry for like wanting to know as much as I could. I just didn't know what to do with it, like no one was there telling me like that there was a career path for it until like I said, I was 17, and I met a gentleman named David Lamfrom who was working for the organization I actually work for now, National Parks Conservation Association, in the position I'm actually in now. But he was sort of the person that like showed me like, no, you could do something with this. Like you're a smart enough kid that like you should. Well, not he didn't put it like that, but he was like, you should go to school for this. Like you should go to college. You should fight for this place, because you grew up here. Like you of anybody should be the person to fight for this desert. And after that, yeah, I spent some time working various conservation jobs. I worked for the Bureau of Land Management as a biotech. I worked for the National Park Service as a biotech, doing some endangered species work with endangered fish, one of the endangered fish that we have here. I was a field person. I took every like field job that I possibly could find that would get me out into the desert and learning about it. Do like AmeriCorps and like just different conservation crews. And then I went to college. At now Cal Poly Humboldt. Then it was Humboldt State University, and I went there because they have a really really renowned wildlife program. Their wildlife program is kind of like top notch in the country, and like it's a state school. It was really easy to get into. My grades weren't the best, but like that program really like solidified my interest in like wanting to pursue some kind of conservation job. And I was there for 4.5 years. I picked up that degree as well as a degree in journalism with an emphasis in science communication. So that started my education there. I also met my wife there, so I owe that to that school too. But yeah, I think that sort of wraps up my education. I mean, I could get into my career now, but yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a good summary there. And so for people that are sort of wanting to do something similar, or have a similar interest, a degree. So was it a degree in conservation? Is that what the degree was called, or?
Yeah, so my official degree was it was a Bachelor of Science in Wildlife with an emphasis in management. Yeah, so the degree itself was in wildlife, but it's basically a more specified biology degree. Um, yeah, like getting a biology degree is pretty much the same thing. This one was just like more applied science to like field biology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, my experience in school was my high school, my grades were okay. And then when I started university, my grades were horrible because I was just taking like random courses and things that I just wasn't passionate about. And eventually I stumbled into anthropology, which I was really passionate about. And suddenly my grades sort of skyrocketed because I was really, really enjoying what I was doing. Is that a similar experience that you had?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could say that I did really well in college. I was like kind of a C student, and like I have ADHD too, and I wasn't diagnosed until after college, so that kind of like did did a number on or a number on my grades, but the classes that like herpetology, I had to get an A. It was like a matter of pride. I was just like, I'm not going to get anything less than an A in herpetology. Yeah, really applied classes were like really super interesting to me, so I like really applied myself. But classes like biochemistry and like biostatistics and biocalculus, like I was just surviving, man.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I hear you. So tell us a little bit about the role you have now. I think it's maybe somewhat of a more recent role in the last couple of years.
Yeah, yeah. About 2 years ago, I got a job, as I said, as the same job as kind of my mentor David Lamfrom, as the California Desert Program Manager for the National Parks Conservation Association. And what NPCA is essentially an advocacy slash adjacent nonprofit, a nationwide nonprofit affiliated with the Park Service. And what we do is we kind of fill in gaps, I think, for what the park can't do. So being a federal agency, the National Park Service can't like lobby for their own funding. They can't take hard stances on things that like affect the parks. So that's sort of our job. Like my job as the program manager is sort of to look out for the desert parks. So I look out for Joshua Tree National Park, Mojave National Preserve, Death Valley, kind of Lake Mead, and kind of Manzanar Historic Site. But the big three are those big three desert parks. And I work really closely with the superintendents and the park staff just to sort of try and assess what the needs of the park would be to make sure that they maintain this reputation, this standing of being like places for families and people all over the country and the world to come and connect to wild spaces. And that really it hits home for me because like that's what I've done. Like I love this place so much, and like I grew up here and it's done so much for me as a person that like being able to work in a space where I can give back and I can help people connect to it as well is like I do that every day, man. I love it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you just have to look at your Instagram page and see the beauty of the area. And for anyone that hasn't been to that part of the world, it's a pretty incredible, and it's very different. Like a desert ecosystem is extremely. Like I live in the prairies in sort of the Great Plains in the middle of the continent essentially, and it's a totally different experience. It's very lush and green, but then you go to the desert and it's almost like every piece of plant life is even more remarkable because of how extreme the conditions are. Can you tell us a little bit about the day-to-day role? Like before we started recording, you said I'm super busy. It feels like I don't have a lot of time off. What are you up to? What does the actual boots on the ground work look like?
Yeah, man, it varies, right? Because like the issues change practically every week to every day. Like there's always something new that's popping up, or some new project that's popping up that's threatening like intact habitat for tortoises, especially. That's one of the things I really pay attention to. But yeah, like day to day, it's like really seeing it almost feels like triage a lot of the time, where you're just kind of like trying to do some kind of work to affect the change that you want to see. And like coming from a field person background where a lot of my work was very tangible, everything was like I fixed that fence, the fence is done. I repaired that trail, it looks better now. The work I do now on a daily basis is like really well intended and really well like thought out, but it doesn't yield an immediate result. It just kind of gets cast out into this ether, and like it comes back with a new set of problems, and then try to solve those problems. But right now there's some really exciting stuff going on in the desert that I'm working on with my colleagues from different environmental organizations. The big one being Chuckwalla National Monument. It's a national monument, a massive one, about 630,000 acres now, maybe give or take a couple thousand acres. But it's named for the Chuckwalla lizard. If you don't know what that is, it's like our big iguana, like big kind of rock iguana that lives in the deserts in the Southwest. But yeah, that's really that's what's taken up a lot of my life for the past 2 years. It was kind of like right as I was starting, that effort was starting. So I've been in it since then, and it was getting to the point now where it's looking like we're getting closer to it actually happening and being established. The importance of that place is, if I could go into that, like kind of why we're, yeah. So like why we're doing this, right, is the desert landscape, like it really requires broad level protections to remain functional, right? Like you can't protect small parts of it. Like this desert is what it is because of how vast it is and how interconnected things are on that level. So what Chuckwalla represents is kind of a missing puzzle piece of protected land in our California desert. So you look at where our national parks are, they're kind of like in a row. You got like Death Valley, that's kind of the northernmost, and you have Mojave right between Death Valley and Joshua Tree to the south. And the lands between there have protections, but south of Joshua Tree, there was never really any like cohesive protection. There's smaller like levels of protections, but a monument really represents a higher level of protection and a higher level of attention being paid to it once it's established. So our intention with getting Chuckwalla established would be to kind of bridge this gap and make this huge swath of protected land in California complete. So it's really hard to do without showing people on a map, but you could check out protectchuckwalla.com, I think, or .org. I should really know that, but Protect Cal Desert. If you Google the Chuckwalla National Monument, the website will pop up right there, and you'll see a map, and it'll make a lot more sense, hopefully.
Yeah, yeah. No, I can picture it. So you're essentially like connecting these chains. And what? So is Chuckwalla, are they endangered at all, or threatened?
No, they're not. At least not in California. I think there's some island species down in Mexico or Baja that might have some kind of status, but our common Chuckwalla is not protected. It's just kind of it's a really charismatic lizard. I mean, it's one of those bigger, like kind of like the tortoise, where it's like a larger reptile. Um, Kinda, and it's not so much that the lizard like has any like major significance to the campaign itself, it other than like the mountains that are within the proposed boundary of the monument are named for the Chuckwalla. So you have like the Chuckwalla Mountains and the Little Chuckwalla Mountains. So we were like, we got to call it Chuckwalla National Monument. And then the Chuckwalla had some importance to like some of the tribes in the area, or some significance, and tribal involvement with this has been huge. That's one of the things we really wanted to make sure happened, was that the tribes were, one, aware of this, and two, well, you know, and also had a large part in its establishment, just because of how important the landscape is to them.
Yeah. I mean, Chuckwalla are a really incredible species to look at, so it makes sense. And that's sort of the balance that you have to strike, right? Protecting the environment in a way that you want people to come visit it, but you also don't want to be changing things and putting like paved paths through all these areas and like essentially commercializing the desert and effectively ruining it. But you want people to appreciate it and come visit it. Yet it's also a place that's actually, you know, relatively dangerous in the middle of the summer. It's hot. You can't just have people wandering out into the desert to look at things. So I imagine that's probably a difficult balance to strike.
Yeah, for sure. And like one of the things we wanted to make sure with this monument too was preserving like recreation access, right? Because like if it wasn't for me, on a personal note, like if it wasn't for me like going out as a young one, not knowing any better, and like collecting every lizard I saw, and like picking up rocks, and just like driving around on like a motorcycle, like, or hunting rabbits or quail with like my family, like I wouldn't have the appreciation for stuff that I have today. You know, people have their own paths to get in different places, but like being able to do that on the landscape and interact with the landscape on that level growing up really was really impactful for me. So maintaining recreational access, like the ability to ride a dirt bike through there, or like pick up a rock, like, and check out a rock, like, or go look for a lizard, you know, that kind of stuff is super important with places like this, because you can't put up fences and be like, hey, keep out of here, like it's protected now. Like that's just not the way that things should work. So that's a big one for me too.
Yeah. That makes sense. So I'd love to spend some time just discussing the desert ecosystem, and you know, there's a lot of people who keep arid species that are trying to replicate these systems, and quite often it's just like, hey, I throw some sand in and now it's like a desert. But obviously the desert ecosystems are way more complicated and complex, and so I think we could dig into that a little bit. I'm also curious, how different is like Mojave from Joshua Tree, for example? Are they visually different? Is there things that you can easily identify each other from?
Yeah, like the parks that you're talking about, like the park units. Yeah, so like Mojave to me represents kind of like everything that the Mojave Desert as an ecosystem can like throw at you. You know, it has sand dunes. It could go up to like, I forget what the elevation of some of the peaks are, but you get like pines at some of the top of the peaks there. In between, you have like rocky outcroppings. You have alluvial fans and like all these different like habitat biomes that like sort of make up the elevational range that makes up the Mojave Desert. Joshua Tree is a it's still a high desert, but it also has some influence within it of the Colorado desert. So it's kind of two deserts in one. In the southern part of the park, you get a totally different habitat type, a totally different desert. And then Death Valley, of course, is like is different as well. It's just like so no, I don't want to say bleak and make it seem like it's like a sad place or something like that. But yeah, I mean, yeah, but I mean, it's very visually different. You know, it's obviously probably the one of the hottest places on Earth. And yeah, the life there is just like that much more extreme. So, but even between these three desert parks, they're pretty different. But yeah,
Are there things that strike you as some of your favorite aspects of these desert ecosystems? Like you don't have to go through each system, like the Mojave and Joshua Tree and Death Valley, but are there things that when you're walking through, like whether it's plants or animal life, that you just are flabbergasted by?
it's been my whole life, man. Even to this day, there's stuff that like I go on hikes and I see stuff and I'm like how and why, like yeah, man, there's just it's when you take the time to like walk through this landscape and like really explore it like intimately, then that's when you start realizing just how crazy like it actually is. Like a lot of the times people drive through it and like or they're driving through like the desert like on their way to Vegas and they're just like, what the hell? There's nothing out there. There's like some bushes. Like nothing can live out there. But like when you find out that there's like so many species of reptile and so much biodiversity. Like it's one of the most biodiverse places on earth. Like people don't realize that. You don't think of a desert being biodiverse, but because of those like pressures, biodiversity is just a result, you know? But yeah, I mean, it's hard to pick something specifically. The plant life is amazing. The reptile life is of course amazing. Like, yeah, I mean, I could go on for days about all the stuff I love about it, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Do you think there are? I mean, do you think there when you if you watch somebody replicate? I'm not sure how much you interact with the herpetoculture community, but if you watch somebody replicating an arid desert or an enclosure for some sort of arid species, are there things that you think that could be added just based off your experience of being in these ecosystems all the time? Like, are there mistakes people make, or like something like humidity? I can imagine is people do things just because of the way you think a desert is, but when you're actually in a desert, you realize, oh, it's not that at all.
One thing that definitely is that I've realized over the course of, I've kept reptiles my entire life too. And like, um, one thing that like I think people may or may not know is just the important like with leopard geckos, right? You give them like a humid hide. I think that needs to be something very like across the board for an arid species, just because of how dependent they are on them in the wild. Like even if it's something like, banded geckos, aren't normally something I think maybe people do put humid hides, but it's not like doesn't come to mind immediately to have it in there. Even some of the diurnal lizards, like side blotch lizards, desert iguanas, even chuckwallas, like those are animals that seek out those humid, cooler pockets. And like those chuckwallas are like they want like the worst. They want like a 200-degree basking site or something. They occupy an area where they can get real deep into those cracks. And like at the bottom of those cracks, there's probably either pools of water that are collected, or it's just like a little bit more moist because the sun hasn't like dried it out. Like I think just keeping that in mind that like desert species seek out refugia and like incorporating that into our care is so important.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one thing that comes to mind for sure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you're like to dig in through the soil or the sand, how deep would you have to go to start seeing like moisture buildup?
Not far, man. I mean, like especially after this last winter we had and how wet everything was up until maybe like I don't know a month or two ago. I could probably go out to some areas and dig like 8 or 9 inches down, the soil will be just like really, really damp. So yeah, and it's pretty it's still pretty saturated out there. And even in the drier months, like even if we haven't like had rain like we have, like the tortoises are really the ones that like are the gauge for that. Like their burrow depth will go down as far as it needs to reach those areas. So occasionally that could be like, 10 feet that like they have to go down to well, the burrow length would be 10 feet from the surface. It'll probably be like 2 feet, but yeah.
Yeah, that is pretty amazing, and that was the one thing I noticed while I was there was it's pretty dusty. Like there you could, I think when I went to Palm Springs, it was like a couple weeks before there was like one of those dust storms. So when we got there, there's just like a fine dust on everything. It's just like that's just in the air, which is interesting. Like you can see the sand almost like sparkling in the sky, which also probably impacts some of the solar rays that come down because it's creating some blocking a little bit of the strength of the sun. But yeah, the dust is pretty extreme.
Yeah, the dust can be crazy, and then air quality is also an issue here too that I'm still even learning about. Like we have some pretty bad air quality here just because of like the San Joaquin Valley. It really is the source of like our air pollution here, which is weird because it's like so far away. But yeah, for whatever reason, because of the way the winds move or whatever, we get a lot of like air pollution here, and like we get the warnings all the time, and that's sad. I mean, that's not an environmental thing, but it's just another factor of living here, coupled with like random dust storms and like haboobs.
Yeah. If someone was to go herping in that area, what are some tips? Is it a nighttime only type thing, or how are they going to find animals?
Yeah, man. It's tricky, man. Like desert herping's been it's not really even what it used to be. Like I've been being able to call myself a herper since I was like I don't know, like 18 maybe, so like maybe 14 years. And my buddy Mike Clarkson was kind of the one that got me into that. And he lives here now too. He lives up here in Yucca Valley. But just talking to him about like what it used to be like a lot of it used to be like, that we had our roads that like were so solid, just like remote roads that we could like cruise and pick up like 5 or 6 species or more like a night. And now with just how condensed like California is becoming and how trendy the desert is becoming to people in like Los Angeles, there's so much more like car traffic here. So like our roads aren't what they used to be. There's still like really great roads near like water sources. Like, I mean, I don't think I'm giving away a spot when I bring up like Whitewater Canyon. Like that's a pretty well-known herping spot. That road is always going to be solid because of its adjacency to the water. That's really, if there is a tip, like is just trying to figure out, like do your research and find out places that are near water, or like maybe even like transition areas or ecotones that like kind of bolster biodiversity. Those tend to be areas that like, I mean, I kind of look at now just because they're also interesting too, where you get like a mix of different like influences from different species in those areas because of water, because of resources. Generally though, desert herping is a nighttime activity if you're looking for like snakes and stuff. I mean, it's everything hides during the day. I mean, in the springtime, it's a little different. Like now, we have tortoises that are crawling around. Mine's trying to like get into my cactus outside right now. But so sorry if you hear that in the background. He's like climbing. But yeah, generally like in the springtime, you can find some snakes out during the day. Boas will be out in the mornings, like king snakes. Some of the diurnal snakes will be out a little bit longer versus the summer, when those diurnal snakes will really stick to like the twilight hours, where they're active in the first few hours of the morning and then like buried in a hole or in a tortoise burrow for like midday, and then they come out like right at sunset or whatever. But,
yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Nighttime is always probably the best time to go. I think when I was there, the only reptile I saw was like those little fence lizards. I think it was fence lizards. They're just scurrying around, which to me was still pretty cool. I mean, I don't get to see reptiles outside in the wild that much, besides one species of snake. So I thought it was pretty neat. But it is always nice to see, especially like you said, there's some of these amazing species like Chuckwalla and desert iguana and those things. And when you're out in the field, of those things that you would even if you're during the day, you have a chance of seeing, or is that basically you have to intend to go looking for them?
No, it depends on the area. There's always something, right? Like it's knowing what's out there. You have to know what's out there to know what to look for, kind of thing. So like depending on the area, the desert, like if you're around rocks, like you're around big rocks, like to look at like the tops of the rocks, and you'll probably see some lizard up there, whether it's a chuckwalla or a spiny lizard or an iguana. Like there'll be something there. But yeah, well, there's a lot of stuff out. Like the lizards especially are pretty active. Like we have great lizard diversity too. So yeah, it's not to say that you can't do any herping during the day here. It's just yeah, if you're in
Better
it for
bang for your
snake,
buck. Yeah. Oh yeah, for
yeah,
snakes. Yeah.
yeah.
And so speaking of snakes, obviously rattlesnakes are fairly prevalent in the area, and that's probably, I imagine, is probably where you're going to have the most human animal conflict, maybe out of all the species that are there, just because people are so afraid of venomous snakes. Is that something that you have to work with or deal with on a fairly regular basis? Is just helping people manage that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what I do, like I don't really have like there's local folks here, especially who have like a reputation of being like rattlesnake removal people that like will actively go and like help you out. But I feel like my role and a lot of like my friends' roles, how we feel about it is like the most important or the most impactful way we can help these people is by educating them, by kind of talking to them about like what rattlesnakes are really about versus just like perpetuating a fear of them by saying like, oh, I'll come get it away from you, like because people are afraid of it. That's why they call you. They don't want it near them. But if we can educate people and tell them like, hey, like this thing is just there looking for food. It's there because of these reasons. Then they can make the choices to like get rid of the reasons why a rattlesnake would be on their property. I mean, there's always a chance being in the desert, but yeah, as far as like the conflict mitigation stuff, it really comes down to education, I think, and like showing people that they're smart. One, like these aren't dumb animals. They're very like one like maternal. They're very like territorial. They're very in tune with the environments that they occupy. So the more you explain something to somebody, the more I think they understand it, and the more they understand it, the more they tend to like not want to chop it up with a shovel. I mean, that's the yeah, yeah.
You had posted a picture. I'm not sure how long ago it was. It was like a very small rattlesnake, maybe a baby, or maybe it was just a small species. I don't know, with a little bit of tape on its mouth to keep its mouth closed. And you guys were using, I don't know if you were using it or if you were just part of a program that was using it for canine aversion or teaching dogs to stay away. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So that's my some good friends company that I helped them with like snake handling. That was sort of my role with their aversion training, was to be a person who puts the snakes out and like make sure that they're good, make sure that they're hydrated, make sure they're not getting overheated. And yeah, the tape on there, Eric, the owner of the company, he's another one of these like really solid herp conservationists. He cares deeply about like those animals, and like I think that's why. I mean, there's an education component to that too, right? Where like while he's training their dogs, he's also talking about like the rattlesnakes and like how they behave, and like it's kind of a dual purpose, I think, scenario there. But the tape there, it's really just meant there to hold their mouth closed. I mean, it doesn't like pinch anything. It doesn't like stop them from like drinking, because that's part of what my job was like to monitor the snakes, consistently like temp them, and like make sure that they're staying between like a certain like a comfortable range. And then if it was like a sunny day, I'd make sure to have like the little cap of water to like give them some water to cool down. They can still drink perfectly fine. Like really the point of using those live snakes in that scenario was to give as accurate of a depiction of a rattlesnake to the dog. Like you could put a fake rattlesnake out there, but the way that the training works, it doesn't work nearly as well unless the dog is seeing the actual thing it's going to encounter. And what was so cool about working with Eric and Aaron, his wife, was that part of being the snake handler was knowing to a degree where the people were from. Like if we were training in a certain area of California, we would adjust the species to fit those areas. So like if we were training somewhere down in like Los Angeles, we'd use a lot of like Southern Pacific rattlesnakes. We're training out in the desert, we're using Mojaves and speckleds and sidewinders. And it's just like that degree of like specificity with something like that was really cool.
The best part about providing high-quality reptile husbandry is you get to develop a long-term relationship with your animal. Meet Jackson, my 18-year-old crested gecko. Jackson lives on the BioDudes Terrafauna substrate, which is one of their substrates that's specifically designed for warm biomes and humidity spikes. Like all other BioDudes substrates, it contains organic content to help support the plant life in Jackson's vivarium. It also holds moisture very well, which means humidity is never an issue, even in my dry climate. Another favorite of mine is the BioDudes Bug Grub. This is a supplement powder made from natural ingredients like carrots, beets, spirulina, oats, and potatoes. Everybody knows how important gut-loading feeder insects is, and this simplifies it for me and allows me to be confident when I feed both Jackson and my tarantulas that they're getting the nutrients they need to thrive. Also, if you have a lot of babies right now, this is a great way to help fortify the diets of neonatal reptiles. The BioDude has a ton of great educational content on both his YouTube channel and the website, all about bioactive care, and it's just one of those brands that's doing their part to push herpetoculture into a positive direction and give reptile keeping a better name. That is cool. So are those wild caught snakes that are just used for that, or are those all their animals that they have?
They have them. I mean, a lot of the snakes, or some of the snakes at least, come from like relocations like that. Like people are saying, like, if you here, I'm gonna chop it up or something. But yeah, for the most part, they maintain those snakes. Like there's Eric has them really in a really solid like setting with like consistent food temps, all that good stuff. Really loves those snakes.
And so the goal, so what at the end of the day, what does the dog do? Is the dog just trained to, does the dog alert about a snake, or does it just learn to not go near it?
Yeah, it learns to not go near it. It wants to, like, the point is for the dog to not want to be near that thing and not want to have anything to do with it. So yeah, really that's the point of it, is to make sure that the dog, if the dog sees a snake, it wants to go the opposite way and pull the person. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, obviously that would be probably a huge point of conflict. I mean, anybody who's had dogs knows that some dogs will go after anything that moves. So it's probably how do they teach them to be like? How do they actually teach the aversion to the snake?
Right. So that's where I think people get a little iffy. I mean, it's not a big deal at all. But when people hear the term like correction collar, they automatically associate with like electrocuting the dog. It's not the case here. Eric, for those who are concerned, Eric will even like give them the collar that he uses and like put it on the setting that he's going to use on their dog, and like show them like what it is, and like really what it comes down to is like, have you ever had those muscle ache machines that kind of like, they're like stim machines or whatever, and they kind of contract the muscle. TENS machines, that's essentially what it is. I mean, it's causing a muscle movement in the dog's neck, and like that stimulation is startling to the dog because it didn't do it, So that, coupled with the dog trainers paying attention to when the dog is paying attention to the snake and hitting that stimulation, that's the dog puts it together and says like, it must have been that thing that did that, and I didn't like that. And like the intensity can vary, and like sometimes he'll go from like a really low, like almost unnoticeable one, to like one where it kind of like does like make the muscle kind of twitch, and then it just builds like that kind of nervousness around the snake, and it's so important to make sure that the dog is paying attention to that animal, because you don't want the dog to think that it's you. You don't want the dog to be averse to like a person with like a remote or like some stick or something. So the trainers also are all very versed in like, how the rattlesnake is behaving, if making sure when the rattlesnake is rattling, like, and I think part of the course is also to like train the dog not only on like visual stimulation or visual what's the word I'm thinking of, visual cues.
Yeah.
But also training it on scent. Like there's a balled up like rattlesnake clump of like skins that Eric keeps, and just kind of puts it on top of a stick, and we have to go out there and spray it every now and then to make the smell come out. So they learn to associate that negativity with smell. They learn to associate it with the sound. Eric is like MacGyvered some rattlesnake rattle in a box, and like it's like remotely triggered. So like the dog will go and we'll stuff it in a bush or something out of sight, and when the dog gets near it, we'll hit the rattle, and then it gets the stimulation, and it says, oh, rattles are bad too, smells are bad too, sight is bad too. And then at the end of it, the dog is kind of like over it, but like really it does have an effect. Like they avoid those things after.
Oh yeah, that. Oh, I have somebody cutting grass right outside my window. Hopefully that's not too loud. Anyway, can you hear that?
No.
Okay, so maybe it's just coming through my headphones. It's all good. Yeah, I mean it makes sense. I mean I know some people are very pro positive training only, but at the same time, like this is probably a one-day thing where it could save your dog's life, or it could save your life too if the dog kind of freaks out, makes a snake get a defensive, and then you get a bite in the leg or something that you didn't see. So it does make sense to minimize any of those conflicts as much as possible.
Yeah, and Eric and Aaron are great communicators with all this. I try to do it justice here, but like, yeah, they explain it in a way that, like, you know, they're very successful in what they do. You know, they have a really good reputation amongst all the people. They do this almost all over the Western United States now. So like, there's times like this summer where they go on massive trips all over the Western US and like do this and all the way up to like, I don't know, Montana maybe, but like, yeah, it's really well received, I think, generally.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, let's jump back to the desert tortoise conservation. You know, we talked about sort of the reverence you have for that species, and you keep them as well. And first, I want to just have a grasp of what's their numbers like population wise. You said that they've just been listed as endangered. How endangered is this species?
So I'm also a tortoise biologist. I mean, that's what I do kind of on my weekends when I don't have like, and when I don't think I have enough to do, I go and like do tortoise biology work. I'm also a board member on the Desert Tortoise Council, and like that council makes up, like, the people who make up that council are some of the leading tortoise biologists in the world. You know, like Christine Berry is like the godmother of like tortoises. She's like she's the one, you know. But having her on there, and like, I think amongst those people, in conversations that we have at like symposium or just in like meetings, I think it's really agreed upon that like endangered even doesn't cut it for this species. You know, it's gotten to that point, and like listings for species are very politicized nowadays. So they don't necessarily reflect the actual numbers that accurately. We're like, they're listed as endangered now, and we're glad for that they're getting some kind of recognition of declines. But the declines that we see in this species give it, in our opinion, the listing of like critically endangered. This is an animal that hasn't shown any signs of recovery. It has only shown signs of decline. You know, there's a number of threats against it, you know, from climate change being a huge one to a lot more mechanical ones like predation from like ravens. The raven population, just to give context for that, is thousands of times larger than it should be in the desert, just because of trash and because of us. You know, they rely heavily on like our garbage, and it subsidizes them. So yeah, ravens really prey heavily on hatchling baby tortoises. And to put it into even into more context on how impactful that can be, desert tortoises, like they have very small clutch sizes, right? So though you're looking at an animal that'll lay 10 to 12 eggs a year. You know, one female lay 10 to 12 eggs a year. And of those babies, in ideal circumstances, I mean, no predation, in an ideal world, say 500 years ago, the survival of those animals to adulthood is probably 10 to 20%.
Really?
You know, they're basically the desert's version of ravioli. Like they're really soft, squishy packets of food that are slow, you know. So things eat them. Snakes eat them. Things have always ate them. Coyotes, bobcats, kit foxes. That's just been natural predation. But now, with our presence and with our influence on like the tortoise population, and because of like climate change and extended droughts, that 10 to 20% is just not there anymore. Like we're barely seeing any recruitment from young ones, and that's why there's such a heavy need for like head starting programs now, where like you have all these organizations and the parks working on pulling gravid females from the wild and having them lay their eggs in pens, putting the tortoise back out, raising those babies, and then to a size where they're less likely to be predated on, and then re-releasing them into the landscape. And that's triage. As I said to begin with, like a lot of the work in the desert is triage. And yeah, that's I hope that puts into perspective just how kind of dire things are for them. Numbers wise, it's like I can't put a number on it. I know all I can say is that even in the past, in my 25 years of doing this, or 20 years of doing this, whatever, I know I don't see nearly as many tortoises as I used to. Like even in the past, 5 or 6 years, the number I've seen of like in areas where I know that they're there, they're just not there anymore. So yeah.
That's as you already mentioned, they are an incredibly important piece to the landscape and just the ecosystem stability in general. So to lose them would be, who knows what would happen. You'd have way more, I don't know. I mean, you start to see a decrease in plant life, and there would be a whole cascade of negative things that would happen. Yeah, I'm sure you're already seeing some of that.
Yeah. We're talking like ecological collapse here. We're like, if the tortoise, so just to kind of break down, like what would happen if tortoises were to just disappear from the landscape today? The burrows normally last a year or two, maybe a little longer, maybe 3-4 years. But without the tortoise constantly going in and eroding that and maintaining that burrow, eventually it'll collapse. And when it collapses, that means that animals lose that big, deep, cool, moist hole to get away from the sun. That's going to continue to happen over the course of, I don't know, maybe 5 to 10 years. Burrows will slowly just not be there. The animals that rely on them will start to decline. Mice, lizards, arachnids. That's food sources for larger predators, snakes, larger lizards, larger mammals, birds. Those then start to decline. So now you're starting to see this kind of trophic cascade of like things declining because they don't have food. And then on a larger scale, because the tortoise isn't eating seeds from like native grasses and native perennials and annuals, the biodiversity of those plants starts to bottleneck. You instead of having a tortoise that can eat seeds from one plant and walk, half a mile to a mile away and poop it out and liven up the genetics of that area, it's not happening anymore. So you just have plants interbreeding. That leads to less vitality in those populations, and then those populations eventually decline. So it wouldn't be happen in a short amount of time, but without the tortoise on this landscape, within 50 to 100 years, maybe 150 years, the desert would look vastly different. There'd be nothing. There'd be no life here. There'd be a lot less life here. There'd be a lot less plant diversity, and it just wouldn't be the desert that we see today.
Wow. And for some people that may not know plant biology, there's a lot of plants that require seeds to move through the gut of an animal in order for them to be scarified and for actually to germinate at some point in the spring or whenever they grow. So it's not that they can just sprinkle the seeds around and have them go. That's how integral species are to be folded in with each other to make sure things operate. So besides the ravens, is there other things that are really impacting? I imagine humans. You said climate change, but is there anything else that like climate change is a tough one because it's kind of a very broad problem, picking up trash to reduce raven population. But is there any other low hanging fruit?
Again, it comes to education, because like another mechanical reason for their decline is through like illegal off highway vehicle travel. So like people going out there and just like thinking there's nothing out here and just like ripping up the desert and like running over bushes and like running over tortoises. There's people that still go out there and like shoot them with shotguns because they're like, yeah, it's boring out here. Like I'm gonna shoot that thing. Really heinous stuff. But like, yeah, I mean, what I always push, like what we push on a daily basis, is just getting people to understand enough that it leads them to a point of interest, that they're like, hey, I want to read about this thing. I want to learn a little bit more about it. And that's all it takes. Because then those people start looking into it and they start like realizing these things. And they're like, I want to help these things. That's why I do stuff like this. That's why I do podcasts. And I do like, anytime I could talk about this and like get people out there to just like get that spark of like looking into it, Like that's really what it takes, man. I mean, like like you said, there's not much we could do. There is some we could do about climate change, but again, that's such a huge issue. But yeah, I mean, what one some of the work I do for as a biologist is like working with the raven problem. That's such a huge problem that I think that there's hands-on ways to mitigate it and like to address it. So one of the things that we do is like subsidy denial, right? We'll like post up outside of like um really heavily utilized subsidy zones like dumps or wastewater treatment plants or organics fields or something, just places where like where the ravens are getting a lot of food, and we'll sit there with these lasers and like scare them away from those sites and like build an aversion to like those areas where they're getting a lot of food. And that's shown some improvement in like declines of like raven population, but it has to happen on such a broad scale, you know, like it's right now it's learning what we can do, and like we're up against it. There's a really quickly ticking clock that we're up
Yeah.
against.
Well,
Yeah.
even just the concept of the burrows is really fascinating. When can you like when you find a tortoise burrow that's being occupied by a tortoise, is it common to also find other species in there as well at the exact same time, or do they typically occupy the burrow after the tortoise has left?
Oh no, they're all in there. I mean, there's been times where some of my buddies, especially, like have found a tortoise kind of on the mouth of his burrow and like a sidewinder just kind of like sitting there with them. Or
That's
like
cool.
you look down into the burrow and there's a tortoise butt that you see there, and then right behind the tortoise butt is like a big Mojave rattlesnake and like a tarantula and like a black widow and like some like Sulpugid, like the little like camel spiders. It's just when you look at even when they're empty, like you like when the tortoise isn't there, you look down in that burrow and there's stuff in there. There's like little like rodents and like rodent nests at the end, like little offshoots that go into something else's hole that it just kind of like used the tortoise burrow as like a start, and then like went down there and like did a little offshoot, and it just kind of like lives in an apartment next to the tortoise. So yeah, they're really heavily utilized.
That's amazing. And most of the animals that are using them, or not most, but a lot of them, do not have the capacity to dig a hole. You know, sidewinders and snakes, they're not going to be digging holes. Even the small rodents can dig little holes, but they're not going to get this giant refuge down deep into the cool, you know, moist area without that starter burrow being done by something so large like a tortoise. So I can imagine how crucial that is. And so you talked about some of these efforts to, you know, do some quote unquote farm raised type situations where the females are laying eggs. How do you go about finding the gravid females? Is that just a seasonal thing, and is it fairly simple?
Yeah, I mean, it takes a biologist, a certified biologist. Not everybody can just go out there and like grab them,
Yeah,
but like it really takes an ultrasound. So knowing when females tend to be gravid is one part of it, which is in the springs. Or actually, let's see, when babies are born. Yeah, so it'd be like in the spring to the summer, early summer, maybe into midsummer. Biologists go out there, collect females, weigh them, ultrasound them, see that they either have follicles or eggs, and then bring them into a pen. And that's just, you know, it's going out there and checking. Yeah.
As far as what they eat in the wild, is that an issue as well, or is there enough? I imagine it's cactus plant material. I'm not sure if they're eating insects and whatnot, but how is it on that front?
Yeah, I mean that's another factor I think in their decline too, is like invasive weeds. You know, the desert has like like a huge problem with like invasive grasses and invasive like mustard, especially, which the tortoises don't eat. Tortoises, the desert tortoises especially, they're they're essentially like an animal that has evolved to survive on like very very minimal nutrients. This thing is eating like 85% of its diet is like grass, like native bunch grasses and like these tiny like forbs and like annuals that pop up in the early spring. Other than that, like that's about all it eats. It'll eat like there's been records of them eating like roadkill and stuff and like bones for like calcium, but for the most part they're heavily reliant on like native grasses, native annuals, and it's very seasonal. So like these animals only eat maybe 2 months out of the year, 3 months out of the year. They'll
Wow.
and it's springtime, so like they for the winters they're hibernating or they're brumating, they're inactive. Spring, after the winter rains we have here, the desert's green. It's flush with food. They come out. That's when they get 90% of their nutrients is in like the few months that like the desert is actually like alive and like showing that it's alive. Um, After that, we enter the dry season. We're kind of heading into it now, even where like everything is just brown. All the grasses die. Everything gets crispy. Tortoises even still eat that. I mean, that's like how much they could draw nutrients from like, dead, dried up annuals and perennials, and they subsist off of that for at least the first part of the summer. But then in the really hot months, July, August, they're essentially inactive again. They don't come out. They'll come out at night every now and then, or like during monsoons. That's our monsoon season, is like kind of late summer. Water will bring them out and they'll get their water. And that's usually the only time they get standing water is during our monsoons or during like rains. Um, After that, the fall, like with monsoons, like we sometimes get a flush of green in the fall when the temperature's starting to start, diving a little bit and like getting more mild. And that's when they can get a little bit more food before they go down for the winter again. That's also when the hatchlings come out, and like that just puts a finer point on how delicately balanced their survival is here, because those hatchlings, when they come out in the fall, when they hatch in the fall, they need food. They can survive off of their yolk or whatever for a couple months or a month, maybe probably on a month, but they should have some kind of food. And they're heavily reliant on that last flush of green before the winter. So if for whatever reason, because of climate change or whatever, we don't get a monsoon season or we don't get any rains during the summer, there's no flush of annual growth in the fall. So it means there's no food for baby tortoises, or there's no food for adult tortoises. So they go into the winter a little bit more malnourished than they should be. And then sometimes they don't make it through the winter. So there's just like, that's just another way climate change kind of affects like the tortoises here too.
Yeah. And I mean, it's just listening to you talk about that is one of the reasons why people often mess up keeping tortoises, whether, there's obviously different species, but especially the more arid species, is because they actually can sustain themselves on such a ridiculous amount of low nutrient food that when you feed them cantaloupe every day, they don't do well on that. They're not used to, so it's almost very difficult to actually care for them in the way that they need to, because it feels like you're probably neglecting them for how little that they're able to, how little they need to sustain themselves. But I think evolving in an ecosystem that is so extreme, you become so fine-tuned with what you need to survive that even any little balance shift is demise for species like that, where you have something like the raven where they're very flexible and they're doing well because they can eat trash, where the tortoises are just, it's not going to be the same.
Right. That's 100% true. And yeah, that's yeah, you put that really well.
Can you tell us a little bit about saving Slowpoke?
Yeah. So saving Slowpoke is sort of my family's way of, I don't know how to put it, like consolidating all these like side missions that we've been doing like my whole life. Like I think one of the things that we created Saving Slowpoke as an organization, one, for the purposes of education. I mean, that's it's a family effort. We all grew up in Barstow. We saw the effects of education and everything firsthand. So like when we created Saving Slowpoke, we really wanted it to be something like a resource. That's really the idea behind it, is like, let's start an organization that pays attention to communities like Barstow, that is out there, that can speak from experience about what it's like to be them. Like people have come into the community of Barstow for years, since I was little, and they all come in with this great idea of how they're going to help the community get out of this slump that it's in, and how they're going to educate kids and get kids to do something different. Like there's more to life out there, kid. Like they've made attempts. I think earlier I said that no one was doing that, but I think what I mean by that is that no one sticks around to do it. They come for 2 or 3 years when they have their grant money. They make their effort. They get kids excited, like me, get excited about it. Like, hell yeah, I'm going to have this resource that I can like learn from. And then right when you start learning, their grant money runs out and then they bounce. And that's such a hard thing for someone who's grown up in like an underrepresented community like Barstow to deal with. It happens to you every day, you know, like whether like I'm fortunate enough to not have the issue, but there's kids in these communities that, you know, they're either abused or neglected, or they have so much going on at home that they don't have the privilege of exploring the natural world. Like what sense does it make for that kid to be like excited about being a biologist if he has to go home and worry about if he's going to eat or worry about if he's going to get beat up on the way home? Like that's the kind of stuff that we understand, you know. Like my dad grew up in East Los Angeles in the foster care system, in gangs. He was in prison. Like that dude has been to the ringer. And like speaking to these communities, like we just relate with them, you know. We understand them. And I think what we want to do is frame this not escape route. Well, maybe it is an escape route or an escape latch or hatch or whatever to something else through the tortoise. You know, we want to show them that like, look, if you work with this animal and you like, you get out and you like want to learn about it and you want to be active in like its conservation and you want to go out there and pick up trash and like help it out. Like that's just a way to build a resume. You know, like I went out there and I like built a fence that protected a tortoise. You could put that on a resume, you know, and it just leads to this like cascading effect of like, oh, like there's stuff I can do, you know, and then having us there, being from there, always going to be there and constantly being like, hey, like, let's stay on it. You know, like it doesn't take like, I think what the mistake a lot of people make is that like, they think that they can teach a kid something once, teach it to him again when he forgets, teach it to him one more time when he falls off, and then if he gets it by then he gets it, if he doesn't then they give up. Like how we see it is like I'll use myself as the example a lot. Like it took 15 years of people constantly having my back and encouraging me and being like, hey, you're good at this. Like you should stick with this. Like don't, like I fell off a couple times and just been like, you know, I don't want to do this. I'm gonna go like I'm gonna join the military or something. Like I don't want to like, you know, I don't want to do this anymore. But then having people to be like to like grab me by like my neck or like the back of my shirt or whatever and be like, nah, like you're not gonna like not do this type of thing. And like put me into situations where I'm like growing and like learning and becoming more confident. Like that's really what Saving Slowpoke is there for. You know, there's plenty of people out there like the Desert Tortoise Council and like all these different tortoise conservation organizations in the desert that all care about the tortoise, but no one cares about how we can affect change that leads to their conservation through like with people.
Yeah.
And like
which is the only way to do it. They're not going to conserve themselves.
Yeah, we're real firm believers in like you can't tell somebody to love something. You know, you can't be like, you should love this thing for these reasons. I'm trying to do that today with like all the stuff I've been saying. But like at the end of the day, like they have to find it out themselves. They can't like, you can't be like, here, love this thing that I just put in front of you. You can be like, check this thing out. And like, I can be passionate about it and I can explain it in the way that I try and explain it. And hopefully that's enough to crack that armor a little bit and be like, okay, I can look into this. And then it's just a crack in the window, and it's a crack in the door for them to open the door the rest of the way themselves. And that's when people really hold on to stuff. They hold on to it when they've done it themselves, not because someone told them to do it, because they found it themselves. You know, like that's so important to let people fall in love with something and then like explore it themselves. So that's really what Saving Slowpoke's mission is. It's like get people to fall in love with it so they want to protect it.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, I think that's exactly right. It needs to come, you know, I for people that listen to the show, they know that my job is a swim coach. And so you cannot force somebody to want to achieve a goal. You can foster them and help them develop their own goals. But until they come to you and say, this is exactly the success I want to have, that's when you have an athlete that's ready to work with you and you know, pursue these, you know, big things. You cannot say, I want you to do this, I want you to do this. It's just never going to happen. And that person is never going to be driven to do that thing. So I think that's exactly the right way to do it. And what an amazing story, though. I imagine if you had told your 20-year-old dad that eventually he'd be in charge of like a tortoise conservancy, that would be the last thing that he would think he'd be doing.
No, he probably would have tried to stab me.
Yeah, like that's remarkable. What a crazy turnaround, and probably found a lot more passion and value in his life.
Totally, man. And yeah, my dad is really what makes this work the best, because he's so passionate about it. And like when he tells his story to people, like that's what gets them. Like, that's what he puts it into perspective, that like, hey, like I'm not just some dude like coming out here and like telling you, like I learned. Like I was the worst. He was like, he tells people like I wasn't afraid of anything. He's like, I
Mhm.
wasn't afraid to die. He was like, if you're not afraid to die, you're not afraid of anything. He's like,
Yeah.
I didn't care about anything. He's like, and then I got this job when he the way he tells it, he's like, when I met your mom, I I needed to get a job. He's like, I couldn't be this like cholo from East LA. Like I needed to have like some kind of like money to like, take her out or whatever. And like he started working at Fort Irwin, like I said, we're like setting up targets on like a bombing range. And like he's had a lot of downtime out there. And like he said, one day he was sitting out there and it was hot. He was like, it was like probably September or something, which is really hot still here. And like said he was laying underneath his truck just to get out of the sun or whatever. And waiting for the rotations to go through. So you need to go set up his targets or whatever after. And he was laying there, and he says like I was laying there and I heard this like crunching like kind of coming up on me. And he said, and I looked, and there's this tortoise that just kind of got under the car with me in the shade and just kind of like kind of like like it settled down and just like kicked it in the shade because it was hot. And he was like, and I laid there with that thing for 3 hours. He's like, I laid it because I didn't know what it was doing. He said, I didn't know if it was gonna bite me or if it was gonna like what the hell it was. He's like, I knew it was like maybe a turtle, but like, he was at that point, he was just this dude like straight out of Los Angeles that like had until that point had never thought about the natural world in that way. And he said that was what changed his life. He's like, he saw that thing, like he's like in sitting there for 3 hours, I thought about how this thing is living out here, like what's it eating, and like how, and it was just so fascinating to him that like after that he was like, that was it. He's like, I knew that I loved that animal and I knew that it lived here. And I went off of that. And now he's been a park ranger with the Bureau of Land Management for 26 years as a federal employee. So like,
Wow.
yeah, man, he went from the worst of the worst to the best of the best.
That's amazing. I mean, that just, and I think a lot of people listening to this will be able to they can have an experience that is very relatable to that, whether it's, interacting with some form of wildlife or an animal that maybe they keep, because you have there's this innate experience that you can, when you connect with nature, that we all have the capacity to connect with nature, but we're not all given the opportunity to connect with nature. Just whether it's your living situation, like you said, if you're fighting for survival, you don't care about the wild world, especially if you're in an inner city and you don't even get to interact or experience the wild world at all, you're definitely not going to have that connection with nature. But once you do, it's impossible to reverse. And it's very like, it's a comforting and very home type feeling, I think, where and immediately sort of the world unfolds in front of you and you realize how important that is. So what an amazing story. I mean, that is just such an incredible thing. And that is why conserving nature is so crucial, because those experiences are there for everybody. We just have to make sure that their opportunity is still there.
Totally, man.
Dude, that is crazy. I think that's an amazing and a perfect way to wrap up the show. Luke, this was amazing. I think that's like the first time I think I've ever had like a little bit of almost like an emotional response to a story on the podcast. I'm not a very an emotional person, but that really spoke to me there, and I'm sure it did to the listeners. Can you tell everybody everything they need to know about Saving Slowpoke, where they can find more information about yourself and anything else?
Yeah, man. We have a website, savingslowpoke.org. We have an Instagram. It's at Saving Slowpoke. My Instagram is at Luke_Basulto. It's my last name. But yeah, I'm always happy to talk to anybody, man. Like that's the thing too, is that like whether it's about tortoises are just like kind of the example, right? This is, like you said, this is something that translates across the board. But for us it's tortoises. For someone else it could be, hellbender salamanders in the Ozarks. It's just, if you want to talk about living with a passion and having that passion drive you and your efforts to do something good, like I'm always there to talk. You always hit me up.
Awesome. Well, and I'll make sure all of course the links for that are in the show notes. Luke, this was absolutely phenomenal. So thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks, brother. Yeah, it was an honor. Talk to you soon, maybe.
All right, that is the end of the episode. How many of you teared up during that last story about his dad and finding the desert tortoise underneath the vehicle? What an amazing story. What a remarkable tribute to how important connecting with nature can be. You could be someone who's literally from the opposite end of that. You're in survival mode in the city, and to have an experience like that can send you on a completely different trajectory. And I think it's one of the things we want to do with this podcast is to encourage people to connect with nature, whether it's connecting with animals in your own home or getting outside and connecting with nature as it is in a raw fashion. I think is just so important. So Luke, thank you so much for being on the podcast. We'll absolutely have to record another one in the future. It was amazing. Listeners, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, make sure you check it out on YouTube or Spotify. You can leave comments there. Again, if you want to watch the video version, you can do that on Spotify as well. Share it on social media. Facebook or Instagram really does go a long way to helping us find new listeners. Make sure you check out the show notes at animalsathomenetwork.com. There you'll find links to everything that was discussed in the show today, including savingslowpoke.com and Luke's social media handles and whatnot. Please check out customreptilehabitats.com. There's an affiliate link in both the show notes and the YouTube description. If you make a purchase using that link, a commission comes back to me at no extra cost to you. And finally, if you would like to join us over at Patreon, you can do that at patreon.com/animalsathome. There you'll have early access to episodes. And of course, you're directly responsible for the production of the show, because without the patrons, this show would not actually happen at all. It goes, the money that I make through Patreon goes towards editing, and I don't have time to edit. So without an editor, the show wouldn't happen. All right, this is the end of this episode. I will catch you guys in the next one. Thanks for listening.